Hey, Big John here, and you've picked a great time to listen to Dauphin Island Diaries. There's already a growing library of stories waiting for you. You can listen to all of our previous episodes, and you'll find extended interviews, including a nearly 2-hour conversation with Sherry Pope Moon, whose family story has a very unique connection to Dauphin Island. We're just getting started, and like I said, our catalog is growing. New episodes and interviews will continue to be added week by week, so when this episode ends, don't stop there. Scroll back through the archive and discover a few stories you may have missed. Now, let's get into the show. Okay, so looking forward to today's interview. This is going to be, I think, pretty interesting from my perspective, because this is an opportunity for me to be able to learn more about the industry of, the seafood industry in this area. And one of the things that is of particular interest in this area, and it goes back to the prehistory of this island, is the oyster industry. And in our episode 2, we talked about the Indian shell mounds here on Dauphin Island, and that they are middens, that they are made out of primarily oyster shells that were harvested over centuries in the prehistory and actually early history of the island. And so as a result, I do have Jason Herrmann here with me today. He is with the Alabama Marine Resources Division, and he's going to be talking on exactly what I just mentioned there. So first of all, I want to say, Jason, welcome, and thank you for having me here. Thank you for being willing to host this in this ginormous conference room that you guys have here. And thank you very much for being willing to spend your time with us this afternoon.
Well, thank you for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the historical context of oyster management and oyster utilization in Alabama and in around Dauphin Island.
Very good. And by the way, for my folks that are listening, that also are kind of crossover listeners that also listen to the Tennessee History Nerd, he's from Tennessee, or at least lived a good bit in Tennessee, and got his degree from Middle Tennessee State. So he's a Blue Raider, and so that was interesting, given that that's also where I went to college back in the day. So wanted to make mention of that. So with regard to the oyster industry, I mean, it's been something that's had some ups and downs. I think that we are probably in a period of what I would call rebound, where they're trying to redevelop it, and it's, to some degree, it's almost from a farming standpoint as opposed to a wild oyster standpoint, if I'm understanding correctly. But you know more about that than I do.
Yep. So the public oyster harvest has had a history, and like you said, ups and downs. Oftentimes it's just a natural phenomena that will come through. Historically, we would have hurricanes come through, we would have drought, we would have oyster drills, and oyster drills are a predatory snail that happens when the salinity is just right, usually a little higher on the reef. They like salty water. And we'll have periods of high productivity, and something will maybe wipe out a large portion of the oysters or oyster reefs in several areas down here, several important areas, and then they'll come back. Most of our, really all that I know of these periods of time where oysters have been in decline, it's really been environmental, but we still manage the fishery and the fishermen, because it becomes really important when oysters are in decline to make sure that we keep a good portion of our reproducing adults out there. And so it's always this game we play, but we really haven't had an opportunity to overfish. It's always been environmental activities that have brought us down. So I want to make sure that's very clear. In other fisheries, a lot of people will point towards the fishermen, the harvesters, whatever species they're harvesting. But in this case, in Alabama waters, from what I've read about the historical ups and downs of the oyster reef industry and what we're currently kind of going through. We're in a decline. It's really been environmental, whether it's salinity issues, drought issues, predatory issues. There's some man-made things, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and other things that can occur.
So to that point, then, what kinds of man-made issues are we talking about?
So some of the things that have occurred over the years. So the way oyster reefs grow when they're thriving naturally, oysters will settle on the shell that was there before that. They'll grow into an oyster. If they're not harvested, they'll live their lives. They'll die and deposit their shells on the reef, and so it grows the reef over time. So the most persistent reefs are the ones that really, they've hardened themselves over time by having shell deposited and redeposited and redeposited. In fact, cross-section of a naturally occurring reef generally will have almost as much shell under the reef as it will as the shell mound, the thriving oyster reef mound, or living part of the oyster reef on top. And so that makes a stable environment. In about the 1940s, there was a lot of shell dredging was allowed to. The idea was that the shell that was underneath the surface was just lost and not really that important. We can use that in industry, construction, paving, concrete, whatever we needed to do. There's lots of uses for oysters and oyster shell. And so for several decades, there was a lot of dredging of the shell material that was underneath the surface. And we feel now that probably could have led to diminishing areas where oysters can grow.
Okay, so it's that contributed to some of the decline. What about things like dredging the channels and for like the intracoastal waterway for the channel coming out from Mobile out into the Gulf?
Absolutely, that changes the dynamics. Everybody's looking at the different ways in which they change the dynamics. It can allow saltier water to get up higher into the bay along the deep channel. It can break up areas that would have flow or have oyster larvae that could make it from one reef to another. It can cause a barrier to decrease the connectivity between reefs or reefing areas too.
Okay.
So
how has it maybe affected the salinity? Has there been any?
So salinity is affected in a number of ways. Of course, there's salt water that can be pushed up into the bay. After Katrina, we had a large break in our island that a lot of folks said we had a lot of salt water that was pushed up into our bay and led to some of the problems we had with oyster drills, which I mentioned earlier, like saltier water. Mm-hmm. But we go from these drought conditions where it gets saltier and have the predators to yearly conditions where we have a lot of rain in the spring and almost too much, just gushing rain, and rather than it being a matter of being rained on locally and having that fresh water directly hit us, that generally isn't the big deal. If it rains on North Alabama and it comes washing down our Mobile Tensas rivers, that fresh water is the thing that can cover our reefs. And in my opinion, they need some continuous freshwater input to control those oyster drills from time to time. But what happens is you don't have this median between, oh, it's too salty, now we got the oyster drills, or it's always either
one
or.
extreme.
One extreme to the other. It's too fresh because it can kill the oysters outright. If it doesn't kill the large oysters, freshwater below 10 parts per thousand for the duration of a week can kill any of the larvae that are deposited, so it affects reproduction. It can stress out the adult oysters. It may not kill them directly, but they're not going to go into reproductive mode. They're going to go into survival mode, which they basically close themselves up and try to make it through to when conditions are right again. And so a combination of those types of yearly inputs of rainfall have been continuous over the last 15, 20 years, and we haven't had much of an environmental break.
Right. So what I'd like to, we've talked about, what a reef, what a healthy reef, the structure of it. Let's assume just for a moment that the listener knows nothing at all about oysters, but really wants to. What would you tell them about how an oyster reef, a healthy oyster reef, how it's made from a natural standpoint? How nature constructs that?
Sure. So oysters, while I'm sure folks see them, they'll think of other organisms that kind of look like them, whether they're clams or scallops or other bivalves. But oysters themselves, once they have attached to something, they're there for the duration of their lives. But they do have a free swimming stage. So adult oysters will spawn into the water. They will fertilize within the water, and then you'll have a free swimming oyster larvae that swims around for up to 2 weeks. And at that point, it develops a foot. We call those pedivelagers. And pedi means foot. And they'll sink to the bottom, and they'll try to find a substrate to attach to. And then they start cementing to that, and then they grow. Now, these are, if you look at a printed period on a page, that's about the size of these larvae. So they're very small. When you have poor environmental conditions, they're the quickest to be affected by those things. But they settle, and then they'll grow, and they can actually start reproduction about 30 millimeters. And most of those smaller ones are male. Biggest ones are female, and what happens is the males will turn into females after a certain point, and they'll totally switch, and those will be the egg producers. So the females, the amount of eggs that are produced is really dependent on the size of the egg, or the size of the female. Larger females, you have exponentially more eggs than a smaller female. And so when I'm talking about a large female, that would be about 3 inches or 76 millimeters. And they reproduce, they settle, they grow, and if they're not harvested, they'll die right there on the reef. Their shell will fall apart, and they will, basically that shell just falls to the bottom, and it becomes the substrate for the next oyster larvae to settle on. And if this happens successfully year after year, decade after decade, century after century, you have the establishment of growing reef. It actually grows a mound. The weight of it kind of pushes the earliest shell down into the substrate, but it still holds it. Its surface area will hold it. And this will continue until the next natural disaster, or if there happen to be over harvesting or something like that, that can bring a decline as well. I won't say over harvesting won't bring a decline. But again, it's been environmental factors here in Alabama.
So going back to where we were talking about back in the 1940s, where you had the situations with the dredging of the oyster reefs and pulling all the substrate out. How many centuries? Or let me just that's a leading question. Let me just ask, how many years would that likely have taken with it that they had been in that position, or is there even any way to tell? I mean, it could have changed through storms and those kinds of things, obviously, but
I think easily I'd say several hundred years, but honestly, until people become more efficient at harvesting and really are able to, or more efficient at dredging in that case, there wasn't much that affected those reefs. So I would say definitely hundreds of years of buildup of those reefs were removed, possibly even 1,000.
So how does the depth of water affect things? And so was there any impact by dredging and making the water much deeper there in terms of oyster reproduction then after that?
So the depth can affect them. So generally, if they're under 12 feet, 9 feet, or below, the mixing of the water can bring oxygen down to the bottom and bring the nutrients down. If you start having deeper water, you could get into situations, and we have certain reefs that have become unproductive because of low oxygen. They have low dissolved oxygen, and it's mainly because the oxygen just doesn't get that mixing down to that depth. Low oxygen is also tied to salinity and temperature of water during the hottest parts of the year, you have the tendency to have lower oxygen. So
with where we are right now, right out here is the bay. Behind the building here are where the middens are. This is where if the archaeological studies that I've read are correct, they came down from Bottle Creek in the prehistoric period, in the Mississippian period. They came down here. This is where they set up. They had this ring of mounds here. When I was talking to John Maresca a few weeks ago when I was here, this would have been much shallower at that time.
Yes.
And so they could have waded out and harvested those things very easily. Wouldn't have, our guys now have the tongs that they use, the long handled, reach in and grab that would not have been necessary. They could have done this by hand just about.
Yes, they could have done that by hand, and I'm sure plenty of folks do it. Even these days, some folks will still get out and harvest by hand. The majority is tongers. But the Native Americans also developed rakes from the materials that they had, and very similar to what we use today, too. So let's see, in the 1750s or so, some of the French explorers and things that came by had witnessed some of those things and logged some of those. That wasn't necessarily in the Gulf, but that's, folks figure out the best ways to do things.
Sure. Well, where I was really going with this, it had to do with how the conditions would have been different, with it being shallow enough that they could have harvested by hand. It wouldn't have needed necessarily to have the tongs, rakes, those kinds of things. How would that have been different from an environmental, ecological type of a situation for the growth and sustained existence of oysters in this area right now? Because it's much less than it used to be.
Yeah, so I think, oysters that are closer to the surface. I don't know if you've looked out into our bay, and it's kind of brown and
murky
and murky. A lot of turbulence and a lot of sediment gets turned over on a regular basis. I think oysters, at least here near the surface, have access to more phytoplankton. So those are the things that they filter out as the marine algae. And of course, algae is a plant. They need light. They're going to do better near the surface than underneath the murky water. Doesn't mean they're not mixed in and that they can't get to them down there. But on some of our oyster farms, they'll have them in cages that are nearer to the surface, and they'll have a pretty quick growth rate. So,
and I've even seen, interestingly, the current episode, the one that we just released this morning, is on artificial reefs. And I know that David Walter Marine, that they've developed specific reefs for oyster farming, for like estuarine type of environments, to be able to help with that. I know that there's several operations over like in Biobattery that are working on the farming, and so I think that those guys, are they like doing suspended type racks that they use to keep those near the surface? Or
there's several methods. There's the long line system, and it's Australian long line, where they have several baskets that they hang on a line. Sometimes they'll put them in floating cages. It's basically cages that have a pontoon on one side, and they'll flip them over so the oysters are underneath the pontoons, of course, in the waters where they're feeding and all those. For both of those systems, it's real important for just for the appearance of the oysters and to get them defouled. It doesn't necessarily affect the taste or the health of them, but definitely they look prettier on the plate when not so many things are growing on them. So in all those instances, the pontoons, they would flip them over where the pontoons are on the bottom. The oysters are up in the air for a certain amount of time to keep barnacles and things from growing on them. And then with the long line system, they just lift up the lines and put them on a higher hook, with the same principle of just kind of keeping things from growing on them.
Okay. And then, so from that standpoint, what you were talking about, that where they filter, you just mentioned this. One of the things that so in Tennessee, as you know, we also have freshwater mollusks. which are similar in some ways. Obviously, saltwater, freshwater, very, you've got that major difference there. But in talking to, his name is Bob Keast in Camden, Tennessee, where they have the Tennessee Freshwater Pearl Museum, he talks about with me that this, these mollusks, they're filters. That's what they do. So wondered if you could speak to that a little bit and speak from a biological standpoint how that all works.
Sure. So oysters have to sit. They can't go chase after their food, and food has to come to them. So that's when you have conditions where you have, moderate currents and continuous overturn of the water, wind-driven turbulence and things like that. It's really good for oysters because it makes sure that they get a constant stream of the phytoplankton, the algae that they like to eat. But yeah, they're great filter feeders. A large oyster can filter up to 50 gallons a day. Wow. And often when we're trying to get a restoration project going for oysters, we make sure that folks know that it's not just trying to get the oysters growing, it's trying to also bring back the environment, the habitat. And part of that is if they're filter feeding, they're taking sediment out of the water, they're basically cleansing their surroundings. And so it's within the reef. The reef as a whole, we can talk about individual oysters, and then we can talk about how oyster reefs affects things. An individual oyster here or there is not going to make that big of a deal, but when you have a large population of oysters, it can actually filter out quite a bit of water over a short amount of time.
Mm-hmm. So for a reef to be healthy, an oyster reef to be healthy, you're looking for water that is the right environment. You're not looking for necessarily water that is crystal clear, clean. It doesn't. If it's crystal clear, clean, they don't have anything to eat.
That's absolutely correct. Yes. So, yeah, if you see crystal clear,
oysters ain't growing there.
It's probably not. They're not going to grow there. There's going to be slim pickings for what they want.
Right.
So, but yeah, just the mix. And I talk about the turbulent sediments, but within those sediments are also the microalgae, the phytoplankton that they're feeding off of.
Okay. And so you said that you had done a good bit of research with regard to the history of the management. Would you like to talk through that a little bit? I'll stop asking questions and let you kind of speak to that.
Sure. And I won't hit every single point. The management of our oysters here in Alabama has gone through a lot of changes, a lot of agency changes, and I'll quickly touch on that. But it's really their roles that I want to make sure that I touch on, and then also the time period in which some of the laws that we still use today came into place. So it's not as important to know the names and the names of the agencies and the folks managing at the time. But really, our first legislative action recorded as in 1852, and then later it was put in the Code of Alabama of 1867. And it was the law basically established that you can only use tongs, and I'm sure you can do some hand harvesting as well. But as far as like dredging and other mechanical means, that took that out of the picture for Alabama harvest. Without diverting too much, there is some dredge harvest from time to time, but it's on a special areas and special permits and things like that.
So to that point, I mean, you said that's for Alabama. So how pervasive or how common is dredge harvesting elsewhere?
So dredge harvesting is currently allowed on our private oyster beds because those are oysters that they've put down and they can harvest them as
they're
they
the
need
ones
to.
who are managing that population, in other words.
Yep. But as far as public harvest, Mississippi has a very large dredge harvesting areas where they are basically driving their boats around. They put down a commercial dredge, it could be about 120 pounds, and they'll do some circles and they'll pull it up. It's a very efficient. They've got larger reefs than Alabama does too, so they manage things, based on their coastline and the amount of area that they have to work. But they have a larger dredging harvest,
reef system.
Yeah, dredging harvest than a tonging harvest there.
Okay, and then how quickly do the oysters rebound there?
So the whole Gulf Coast is kind of in the same environmental slums as we are. They have a lot of the same issues happening. Not exactly, one for one, but definitely there's some spillways that are opened up and affect Mississippi oysters. That it's not just the direct rainfall, but it's upstream when somebody opens up a dam or a spillway to make things perfect where they're at. It makes things less perfect downstream for the oysters. So every state has their own story or stories of how all of those things affect their reefs. But all in all, across the Gulf, I think we're all in a decline. We have these little upswings and downswings, and we're all trying to get to historical levels and do whatever we can to do that. And it Mother Nature just doesn't seem to want to give us a break. All across the board.
Well, I think where I'm looking at this is it just seems to me like those kinds of operations being much more efficient in terms of how they would harvest. If you don't have the larvae coming back in behind and replenishing that, then you're moving in the wrong direction in terms of management. It would seem like that's the reason I was asking. So
right. So, and what you're kind of talking about is whether a system is larvae limited, and at this point, well, if it does become larvae limited, then we're absolutely in the worst the worst conditions that we can be. But at this point, even if the main reefs, and I'm going to speak for Alabama, not the other states, but within Alabama, even if the main reefs aren't doing very well, there's little areas and pockets of productivity within the bayous and things around here that can produce a ton of larvae. And generally, if environmental conditions allow, it shouldn't take very much time to rebound. 2 or 3 years, and they can get back up to their productive levels again.
Okay.
But if you keep having this freshwater input that's really deleterious to this tiny little larvae in the water, or stressing out the grown adult oysters while they're in in their most important periods of time where they're trying to reproduce, it hits them kind of twofold. It doesn't mean that they're not producing. It just means that there's less survival of those larvae. All
right, well, I apologize. I took us down a rabbit hole. So we go back and so Alabama in the 1850s and 1860s, they said you got to use tongs. You can't use other means other than for these special circumstances. And so take us back where we stuck our pin in right there. Let you pick back up at that point.
Sure. So really, from a little later on, from 1910 on to maybe 1930 up into that's where we start to establish most of our mainstream oyster laws. The things like you can't legally harvest. This is from Public Reef. You can't legally harvest anything over 3 or under 3 inches. You need to make sure that you're culling, and what culling is taking off the dead shell and any small oysters and leaving them in the water so that you leave the substrate in there, and also the smaller oysters to be your next year's harvestable oysters. So culling laws applied during that period of time. So they've established public oyster reef wardens and oyster inspectors and things like that. Enforcement has always inspected the volume that a harvester is allowed to have per sack, or however many sacks they can have per day. So they're per day.
So what drove these conservation laws? I mean, in a lot of areas you can look at particular events or particular things that were happening that would be driving when conservation really started to take effect, and how that management was being done. What was driving that?
Well, so I think part of it is Alabama coast is small. all of the other Gulf states, they can get to their reefs, but it might take several hours between. I can get from any part of our Alabama coast to the other within 2 hours. Our oyster reefs are 15 minutes away. The ones that we are the most productive at this time. So that's very convenient for me, but it also means there's not that much area for oyster reefs to grow. When other folks are talking about tens of thousands of acres, we are talking about 5,000 acres, maybe total, maybe up to 7,000 if you look at all of the oysters in the bayous and things like that too. But on our main oyster reefs, we just don't have that many. So if you're an oyster harvester, they're very ingenious and they're always thinking about how to do things better, quicker, more efficient. And I'm sure there was a bunch of dredging that started to occur because they're looking at their neighbors dredging in other states, and they're hearing about how quick and how many oysters they can get in through the day. We didn't really have, there's periods of time where there weren't limits early on to how many oysters you could bring in. So I think the state looked at how efficient folks were getting and said, we can't do the same things as in the other states. We can't allow all of that dredging. We need to make you less efficient, I guess, and so we can conserve our smaller populations of oysters. And I think that's really kind of what led to that, is we really need to take care of that, because the amount of oysters coming into the canneries and the shuckers and packers and things like that was a massive amount back in the day.
And that was, just for folks who may not realize this, and before the bridge, mm-hmm. and you could only get here by way of boat, oystermen and fishermen were really your population of Dauphin Island. And so, that was a pretty big deal. That was their livelihood. And, I don't think it's any accident that, this office is here because of what was going on then. And then what's right next door also with the FDA facility over there.
Absolutely.
So, but okay, so we had these conservation laws that begin to come in, putting size limits, putting what we would call in some areas creel limits, mm-hmm. How much they can actually harvest in a day in terms of number of specimens that are actually harvested. And where did that take us then?
So it's developed different ways to protect them. There's other laws where you could no longer drag shrimp trawls over them, and you can't seine over them, and things like that too. So it's also protecting them from other fisheries that were considered deleterious to the oyster populations. Back before 2011, our oyster season was open all year long. There wasn't any closures except for when the health department would find some sort of health risk or something, where there was too much rainwater or there was point source pollution or something like that. Something got out into the water and they had to close everything. So there was those types of closures. Very rarely in Alabama's history have we stopped harvest because of a lack of oysters. But it has happened a few. But most of the closures are health related. So the health department, we work very closely with them. Their whole goal is to protect human interest, the consumers of oysters. So, and there's always an inherent risk of eating raw oysters that haven't been handled properly. And so a lot of the regulations and things that our enforcement uphold are based on health-related issues too. So when the health department, Alabama Department of Public Health, has a closure, that trumps our open. We might be open for harvest because of oyster numbers, but we close down because of any health issue that they have come across. So then they usually close down. They're trying to close down before any oysters are harvested from any that have gotten into anything or has had any pollution on them.
Okay, no, that totally makes sense, because you're going to want to try to stay ahead of that. If you identify that and can stop the harvest before it happens, then you don't end up contaminating your food. Right. Your food supply, people downstream from where you are here ending up. You hear all the time, well, you've got people who have been exposed to listeria, or they've been exposed to E. coli through something in the food chain, where things were harvested, weren't properly prepared, or what have you, weren't properly packaged. You're staying ahead of that with this.
Yes. So we've always worked very closely with the health department. Our enforcement will confiscate, any sacks that they think are part of a risk based on what the health department has determined. But we've put a lot of things in place since then. Some of the legislation and management has really been put into place to account for not just the amount of oysters being taken off the reef, but to protect consumers, but not just the consumers, but also protect the industry, the dealers, and the catchers themselves. When people get sick, things kind of slow down. People lose trust in the product. The whole industry suffers. And it's not just when people get sick from oysters. If somebody gets sick and in the paper they say shellfish, they immediately think oysters. Last time that happened, it was shrimp, but the oyster industry took a hit from somebody getting sick. So the health department is very diligent in putting in place and working with us to manage those. I mentioned 2011.
Right.
There was a lot of legislation, new management legislation that came through in 2011. We still had the same culling rules, the same size limits, and things like that. But we closed down harvest during the hottest parts of the year. So May 1st to September 30th, they're closed down. Then we can open up from October to the following April 30. So,
and is that from a health risk standpoint?
It's to minimize health risks a little bit. As the summer comes along, you got the hottest parts of the year. Part of what the health department requires is that when oysters are harvested, they have a certain amount of time to get to mechanical refrigeration. And as you get into the hotter months, that amount of time lessens. You end up like July, August. Immediately, and our oyster harvesters aren't really set up for immediate mechanical refrigeration. And so we still allow the private guys to do that, but they also have, I haven't really talked about oyster tags. That's how we mark all of our oyster sacks and help with accountability. Mm-hmm. But they actually have to put an exact time that each sack is harvested, or a group of sacks if they're doing bulk tags. And so there's a little bit more control that they have of meeting those needs, so that they can get them to mechanical refrigeration at the proper time during the hottest months. So it's just a way to make sure that oysters are being handled and put into the freezers at whatever dealer they sell them to. So yeah, we stopped harvest during the hottest parts of the year, and then we really established our oyster management stations. There's always been check stations, and that's where I had talked about the enforcement. They would check the volume of sacks and how many sacks were coming in, and making sure all the oyster catchers. That's from the historical perspective, early 1900s to present. They still do that. But the oyster management station really requires the oyster catchers to check in every morning, and they've got to check out of that station. And what that does, when they come back, they have to basically tell us all about their harvest day. Where did they harvest? How many sacks they harvested? And they also have to tell us what dealer that they're going to take them to. And they tell us how long they've harvested, how long their entire trip was, and how long they actually had their tongs in the water.
So you have a full audit trail there then?
We have a full audit trail. We know where they're supposed to go, and they're required to get them there within an hour of landing. So that's been very good for accountability. If somebody happens to get sick, you can track it back.
You know exactly where it ground zero was.
That's right. And so it may not be the oyster harvester's problem. They're doing everything right. Maybe the cooler that they got put into when they hit the dealer wasn't working properly, or
the middleman taking it upstream.
Yeah, or the cooler in a truck taking it somewhere, something like that. Or the restaurant that it went to, maybe somebody set them in the corner instead of putting them in the freezer or something like that, and somebody got sick at the restaurant. So you can kind of track that back down. And one of the main things I'd mentioned, tags. Each sack needs a tag, and it has that information in it, and that information is also given to us to put into a computer program right there at the management station. So we're out there with them in a mobile trailer, basically a mobile office, getting all that information that we didn't have a really good accountability of what was coming in before 2011 it was put into place.
Okay.
So it's really helped us. Before that, if somebody gets sick and the health department does their investigation, but they're not sure exactly what happened, where it came from, they would go to all the dealers and say, well, if you got any oysters between this time, or this date and this date, they're all trash. and some of them might have been okay.
Right.
And so the industry really gets negatively impacted when maybe some of those folks could still sell their oysters and make a profit and conserve the
population.
The population. And
yeah. So what this lets you do then is be much more targeted and much more surgical, I'll say, in terms of if you have to remove product from the supply chain.
Absolutely.
You can be far more surgical with that. You don't end up having to take this broad-based thing that you used to have to do and say, okay, yeah, everybody throw your stuff away.
Right.
So okay, that's good for a lot of folks.
It protects the industry. It protects the
consumer.
Yeah. And gives us a good accountability of where things are coming from for as far as oyster numbers, where are they harvesting the most and how many sacks are coming out of those, how many oysters are coming out of those areas.
And so in today's data-driven world, then you've got the ability then to track that and you can slice and dice that data a lot of different ways and identify for a lot of trends that you might need to do. If you enjoy the way we tell stories here on Dauphin Island Diaries, there's another show you might want to check out, The Tennessee History Nerd. Same approach, different setting. Stories from across the volunteer state, rooted in place and built from the sources up. You can find it wherever you're listening right now. And now, let's get back to our story.
So along with one of the laws that had been put into place very early on, it was the duty to replant. And I had talked about oyster shell being a good substrate for oyster larvae to settle on. Now they'll settle on anything almost, and sometimes we'll do restoration projects that are primarily a limestone, and they'll settle on limestone instead of the native oyster shell if we're having trouble getting that or it's too expensive. But the duty to replant historically has been the dealers needed to replant half their shell that they received, and that didn't always happen. And so that shell was just lost to the system, lost to the reef system. And so with this legislation that we've put into place, it's 2010, but 2011 is kind of the first round of that. We've established a shell fee, so we don't really require that them deploying half their shell back on the reef. Basically, we'll calculate, and this is just from the public reef, not private. Every sack that comes in that a dealer buys, they owe a shell fee of $2 per sack at this point. And so what that does, that helps us manage the oyster management station, which inherently has a lot of accountability, great strides towards accountability already. It helps us if we want to do some restoration projects, as far as going to use that shell fee to buy shell and put it back in there. That's a big part of what we do too, is replenish shell that's been taken out. But that's how that law has changed. The duty to replant has turned into, you guys don't have to replant, but you got to help us do it. If you've bought public oysters or oysters off the public reef, you'll owe us $2 per sack. And then we'll calculate that along with the oyster management station data. I'll send them an invoice out, and they'll send that back to us.
Okay.
And so we put that in an account that's just meant for oyster management purposes.
Okay.
So that's personnel working the management station. That's vessels used.
So something that just occurred to me as you were talking, and you were talking about they had put half that shell back out there. So first question, and this just kind of off the wall question, and there may not be any connection, but is that where the oysters on the half shell came from? You put half of it back, and so the other half is what you serve on.
I don't think that's where that term came from. It's just kind of the way that they served it.
Okay.
But it doesn't come from that law. I think. So that's just the way, you go into an oyster bar or something and they shuck it open and you're eating them off the half shell.
Right. Well, I just wondered if the other half, that's where they got the idea to use that other half to put back on the.
Yeah, it didn't. I don't think it was related. To that law.
Well, it was kind of a weird thought that occurred to me as we're here. Second thing, let's talk about supply chain here. And it may not be, when I say destination here, it may not be that Alabama it would be who would be supplying that area. That's okay. But let's just say, we're back in Middle Tennessee. We go into a restaurant in Nashville and we order oysters on the half shell. How did they? We don't have oysters naturally in Nashville. They have to come from somewhere. How did all that happen? How did it get from the water wherever it is to there?
All right. So harvesters, they have to sell to a dealer. They can't just take some home. There's a history of folks that would just chuck and sell gallons of oysters, outside of that. And so these days with the 2010 legislation, it has to come through the management station, has to have tags, it has to go to a dealer, and then it can go to a consumer. So it actually has to be cooled down first before we do that, or before somebody can take them home or eat them, or a restaurant can get them. After that, after they're cooled down, if they maintain that temperature, even in transit, they can be shipped out all across the United States. At this point, the technology of refrigeration has really caused oysters to be a staple in places you wouldn't think, just far away from any place that you could harvest them, but they can get there and people can get them if they need to.
I can go to a restaurant in Boise, Idaho, and order oysters.
Yep.
So it's obviously not wouldn't have traditionally been a staple in Boise, Idaho. So,
So yeah, mechanical refrigeration has really been the key to getting them away from the coastal areas, and everyone can enjoy them. So,
all right, and then so that takes us. You said 2010. Does that bring us all the way up to present, or is there additional? Are there additional things that we would add into that have changed the management even since then?
So part of with that, we defined our oyster areas not just by the reef, but we actually gave them a code and everything like that. And we did that up until about 2021, and then we actually decided to go one step further, and we've broken down all of our water into a grid system. So all of our little grids are 500 by 500 meters, and they all have their unique letter number code. We kind of do it like the game Battleship, where we've got A through Z, and then 1, 2, 3 across the way. We'll repeat
Cartesian coordinate kind of thing.
Yes. So we repeat our letters because we've got more than that. But we harvest and keep track of the distinct grids that oysters are harvested from these days. So we're actually down to a 500 by 500 meter grid now that we can actually determine where oysters have come from. We do require the oyster harvesters to report that as one of the things, what grid they were in. And it's kind of neat. We've got it set up to where if they have a browser on their smartphone, and you'd be surprised about, the oyster catchers all have smartphones and everything.
Sure.
They can actually pull up their map, put their location on, and see what grid that they're in. Their little dot shows up.
Okay.
That's not information we get back. We're not tracking them through that or anything, but they can see where they're at. They can zoom in and see the number of the grid, and then they have that information. Now, whether they accurately report that, we've had some issues with that, and we've got some follow-up things where we go out on the water and actually verify where folks are at, not just where they're reporting. So we kind of compare that to where folks are reporting. So you get somewhere folks either don't know or they don't have a cell phone. Some folks just call out the number of the guy in front of them in the line or something like that. There's probably a few guys that are definitely trying to give us the wrong coordinate
Game
for whatever.
system.
But overall, we try to reduce the error and then just verify it by our own accounts. We'll drive around on the water and basically put a track around where people are at.
So coming from a data-driven in healthcare, data-driven environment that I worked in for years, I can see the benefit of doing, of having that kind of data. But why don't you explain that for our listeners a little bit? Exactly how does having that kind of data, what does that do for you from a management standpoint?
From a management standpoint, I mentioned briefly earlier that one of our large roles is for restoration of oyster reefs. And so when we know where the oysters have been harvested from, it gives us a better area to target when we're putting shells back down. So when we have funding to do large or small shell plantings, we definitely want to replace the shell that's been taken. So every time you take a live oyster out, that shell comes with them. It's gone. It's out of the system. And if there's no means of putting that or some other culture back, you really start to deteriorate the reef. But yeah, it helps us to target areas that we're gonna try to build back up.
I do want to just mention really quickly that we are in a public building, so you can hear conversations in behind us a little bit. It's okay. I just wanted to. These people aren't in the room with us. It's just letting you know that's we do have conversations in the background that may come across. So, what about from the standpoint of from a management standpoint? I think the background I have in Middle Tennessee, having been involved in sports fishing and hunting all my life, tracking from the standpoint of understanding populations where they are and ensuring that no area is overhunted or overfished. Is there anything along those lines that you're doing from an oyster management standpoint as well from these grid coordinates that you have?
Absolutely. So when we worked out of the larger areas, we would have to close the large area and just move people off of a main reef just because they hit our predetermined harvest estimate. So I'm not going to call it a quota because we're kind of flexible with our harvest estimate, and I can go into that a little bit better. But it definitely helps us to just close the grids that they're working the most and move them on, and they still have most of the reef left to go.
So you're not having to close down a whole reef as a
That's right.
As a point. Now you're just closing down a 500 by 500 square, 500 by 500 meter square area
Yes.
that really allows you to be a lot more, again, surgical.
And they end up having more days on the reef instead of we're just closing you down. And so we look at individual grids, but we still look at the harvest that comes in as a whole from some of the larger areas too. So we look at it in both ways and then determine. So we don't really have a set number that's coming from each individual grid. We basically break our main reefs around Dauphin Island and Dauphin Island Bridge into three main areas. We've got the Heron Bay area. There's Cedar Point West, which is on the west side of the bridge, Cedar Point East, which is on the east side of the bridge. And there are lots of mini little areas within that and lots of grids within that. But those are the ones that we come up with our estimate every year when we do our annual reef surveys.
Okay.
So basically we come up with this is how many we can allow out of Heron Bay based on we dive on the reefs based on our dives, how many come out of Cedar Point West and how many can come out of Cedar Point East. And then we keep track of that, even if it comes from this grid or that grid or not. The important thing really is the reporting of the actual grids worked so that we know when to close down individual grids. So they may have the run of all of Cedar Point West or all of Heron Bay, but they'll work like the four most productive grids. Oyster catchers are great at finding the most productive areas.
Sure.
That's their job, is to get their harvest, get back in as quickly as possible. That's make it as efficient as they can and try to do that. So they see one oyster catcher having a good harvest, they all kind of clump around.
Sure.
And they end up working, the same grids year after year after year,
Sure.
really working those. So there's certain grids that we're just like, we know they're going to be in there a whole bunch, even before the season starts. And those will probably be, based on the amount of folks within those grids day after day and how much harvest is reported out of those grids. Those will probably be the first ones that we cut off. It's usually 3 or 4 grids, and then we kind of push them out to where they'll spend some more time on the other ones. So we look at the sacks that come from the area as a whole and where those are actually coming from based on the grid reporting, and then we can kind of move them elsewhere.
If you're a business with a strong connection to history, education, travel, or place-based storytelling, and you're looking to reach an audience that values those things, we should talk. You can reach me at john.summers@summersmediaenterprises.com. Now, let's get back to our story. So knowing that these same grid squares get hit year after year after year, how does that impact how quickly they recover?
So our goal every year when we're open for harvest is to leave some behind not take everything,
Right.
Because we got to have our adults to
Sure.
reproduce. So it's a weekly thing where the director and chief enforcement officer and the biologist will get together at this table. We're in a big conference room, and we'll talk about what's come in over the week, and we'll try to make our decisions for what we're going to do next week. If we're going to close anything, if we're going to let it ride another week, if we're going to, it looks like weather has kept participation down, so there's less harvest on there. It's not just less people are coming out. There's usually a reason for it. So we talk about all of those things. We put our heads together and try to come up with the best management practice to not deplete the reefs. But we're also interested in allowing the oyster catchers to utilize that resource. So it's this balancing act. It's not us against fishing. We want fishing, and we want fishing for many years. And we want their
And the whole point is sustaining where you can continue doing that.
So and so we come to these decisions where we pinpoint some grids that we've got to move them off, or else they're going to take them down to a poor level.
So historically, in most areas, your hunters and your fishermen are among your greatest conservationists. Is that what you see here, or do you find that there are people who try to buck the system and you end up having to be a little bit more stringent in your enforcement with them?
Well, along with all of those other resources that folks go through, you still have a large group of people, and within that group of people, you've got the people that really care about what's going on. You've got the people that just want to get what they can get. You've got the people that will take and take until there's nothing if you let them. But you got a lot of people that want things to be good. I've found that there's more of our harvesters that do care about what's going on. They don't always agree with the closures that we do. That's there's some contention sometimes, depending on which grids that we close down.
That's a lot of times, I think, philosophical more so than it is. They think that you're being overly cautious, almost helicopter parent type.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
But we get a mixed opinion across the board. You've got some guys just like, you guys are doing good, management's doing good, this is what we need. We don't need to deplete everything. And there's other folks who's like, why don't you let us take them all? So some folks will think of it as a crop that you plant and then you harvest everything every season.
It doesn't work that way.
And that's it's not the same dynamics as
Right.
terrestrial farming. But I've heard that before. But we've got the mix of folks. We've got a good group of several catchers have been actually planting oysters on their own. We've provided them a permit, so they're out there, and enforcement knows what they're doing and all that. They've gathered the shells on their own. They're taking them out on their own, and they're trying to do some good. And they're taking off their daily other jobs that they have to do this from time to time. And I think we've had a really good. This is the first year I've seen them want to do that, try to do that, and actually do that. And so we're working with them to determine the places that they can and can't go and things like that. But it's really good to see the oyster harvesting community, take part in that too. So, but they're giving of themselves for sure.
Sure.
To do that. When we plant because we've gotten a lot of funding and
Right.
and you have larger planting, but these guys are
This is on their own.
This is on their own. They're using their own time, their own resources.
Sure.
They're doing some good, and they're actually got small vessels so they can get into some areas that we can't do with when we're planting a lot of culch. We blow it off a barge or have it mechanically shoveled off a barge into the areas that we want to, but we can't get into all the little narrow, shallow little spots. And these guys are able to pinpoint certain areas that they know. And they've even done some surveying beforehand, not just putting things haphazardly. They've come back and said, well, we thought that'd be good, but it wouldn't. And they shift their thing. So I think it's a good. The other thing about Alabama being a very small coast is that we know most of the guys that we're working with.
Sure.
And
Small community.
a small community. And other states don't have the capacity to sit down and talk to their oyster catchers on a regular basis. They'll have their commissions and things like that have been appointed by all of these. But we're kind of blessed to where we have that opportunity to sit down and talk to them, maybe argue with them a little bit about this and that. That I'm not going to say that doesn't happen. We don't always have all the same ideas. But,
Sure.
But it is nice to sit down and be like, we all want something good to happen. We might have
Right. different
different methods of doing that, and sometimes closing areas that they don't want closed right away. But just aiding in the restoration has been a great thing over the last few months with several of these guys.
So now I'm going to ask you to get your crystal ball out and kind of try to look into the future a little bit. What does the next 5 years look like for the oyster industry here? What does the next 10 years look like? What's the next quarter century look like?
That is the question we ask every day. Especially when I talk about weather patterns, precipitation, and causing all these freshwater flows and things like that. The question I ask is this just a little period of time that this is occurring, or is this the way it is now? Are we going to go back?
Is this the new reality?
So is Mother Nature going to go back to something that is more conducive to oyster survival and make sure it's not killing larvae during the most important parts of their spawning? They get two spawning peaks, one in the summer when the temperature rises past 20 degrees C, and then in the fall they get one more shot. This is typical. They get in the fall when the temperature takes a drop, they get one more spawn. And if Mother Nature's interfering with one or both of those, it really messes us up. And we've had a lot of spring spawns that have been interfered with because of the spring rains and the fresh water and things like that. So I don't have an answer for you with my crystal ball, but those are the things that I think about. If this is the way it is now, then I do worry about how the oyster reefs. If the oyster reefs are in continuous decline, at some point it's gonna get.
So things I've been hearing from you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm kind of barking up the wrong tree, so to speak here. But you've got a lot of things that you guys. I mean, take Mother Nature off the table for a moment. You've got a lot of things that really impact the oyster population here that you have no control over, that is man-made. So is there any ability to coordinate, like with the Corps of Engineers and with TVA and whoever else that you would be working with? Because I mean, the things you're talking about, I'm going to say even on the Tennessee River, up in Gunnersville and areas like that, when they're releasing water for flood control there, sooner or later it makes it down here. It's going to make it through the Tom Bigby waterway. It's going to end up down the Mobile River, and it's going to be deposited in the bay. It's going to impact you guys. Is there any ability? Are you already doing this? Is this something that's been considered where you're coordinating with them? Recognizing, they're trying to manage the flood control in northern Alabama, but sooner or later what they're doing impacts the Gulf.
And that's absolutely the crux of it. Is people are always trying to work together, and I don't know whether it's another state or just working with the cities that are upstream from you or whatever, and it gets very difficult because each individual area has to make the decisions for their individual area as to, if I don't open this, all of my folks flood,
right.
And you can't fault them for that,
right?
But it's still, how do you find a balance between this community upstream and what's happening downstream? I'm not gonna pretend to have that balance or those answers, but those talks are always going on.
So there is coordination that is you're attempting to do, whether it actually works out to your benefit or not. It is something you're doing.
That's something that I think is happening continuously,
Good. So. Well, because it occurred to me, and I never would have thought about this, but where I live in Tennessee, I'm 30, 40 minutes away from Nickajack Lake. Mm-hmm. Nickajack Lake on the Tennessee River, when they're releasing water and it's going down into Alabama, and it's coming, what they do managing the water just outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee, can impact what you guys are doing down here.
Absolutely.
And I think that's not something before this conversation that ever would have occurred to me. And so it's kind of the old Buddhist thing. It's all connected. And the balance that you're striving to reach is far more complex than probably most people even realize.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's ever going to be any solutions. And even if one state comes up with a solution for their oyster reefs, the next state might still be fighting the battle, between all the user groups of that body of water. Historically the rivers were our roadways, so they were our places where communities had to develop and settle on.
Yes.
They're where all the trade happened up and down those. We've got roads now that take a big chunk of that, and the rivers are still important, but they maybe less so than they were when they were the only reliable transportation.
Even with the trucking, I mean, if you're wanting to haul on a large scale, it's still by water.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, so I think back, of course, things are different now because a lot of the textiles have gone offshore. But I think back to, the 1940s. I mean, it really kind of died out in the 1960s that Knoxville, Tennessee was huge in textiles. And so you would load those up on a vessel and put them on the Tennessee River, and it would come down. And, now, not only, I mean, before it would have gone through New Orleans because it would have come all the way down, it would have hit the Ohio River, it would have hit the Mississippi going down. Now it doesn't have to do that. It can come through Mobile because of the Tombigbee Waterway. Mm-hmm. And so you've got that. You've also got the Intercoastal Waterway that has changed things. So many different ways that we didn't have before, I'll say the 1960s. But now we do. But all of those things that we've done to make commerce more efficient also has a biological impact.
Absolutely.
And an environmental impact. So, and that also means that there's an awful lot more variables that impact what you're doing that would not necessarily have been there, I'll say 60, 70 years ago.
That's true. That's true. So, and those impacts are always kind of being looked at for exactly what they're causing and things like that. It's important to know how complex, or to think about how complex things are. It's not just Mother Nature. It's Mother Nature plus these other things that are going on. Mm-hmm. Mother Nature plus dredging out the intercoastal waterway to help with commerce and have safe passage. Mm-hmm. We all like our goods and
right,
and they get there relatively. Everything's expensive these days, but they get there relatively cheaply because there's safe passage of the vessels that can get them to where they need to get to their harbor. So
right, but I mean, then you've got places, because for example, Bon Secours used to be a huge oyster bed over there. Mm-hmm. Not so much now, is my understanding, and you could probably answer that far better than I could. But how much has that been impacted by, say, the Intracoastal Waterway?
So the exact effect or
hard to say.
It's hard to say, but we're sure it has had some impact. It's allowed different water quality to
change
roll
the
through there,
change the temperature. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
So I mean, you've got a ditch that's been dug in there, so
mm-hmm.
you
change the depth, change the oxygen levels.
Yep.
So all the things that and I was reading something and you were able to answer this far more succinctly and accurately than me, but oysters are their environment, it's a very narrow, fragile environment that they thrive in.
So oysters themselves can be pretty hardy. They can live in a range, if there's nothing else happening, they can live in a range of salinities. They can live in a range of temperatures. Even they can stand some low oxygen for a small amount of period of time. So, but when you just have this continuous amount of fresh water on one side, 15, 20 days of less than 10 parts per thousand or something like that happening during our most productive times of the year when they're spawning, or it goes the other way where the oysters are fine with a little bit higher salinity, up to 25 parts per thousand, they'll be all right. But the oyster drills, there's nothing to control them. Fresh water really kills those drills. So I think there's always a good thing to have some freshwater inflow periodically throughout the year. Mm-hmm. They're always going to be there. They're a natural predator, but it controls them to where they can't run rampant and lay their egg sacs all over the place and take over pretty much.
Which is the reason why they thrive more in estuarine type waters.
Yes.
I mean, they could survive easily in the more salty, more saline areas, but then they've got to deal with predators that there's no means of controlling in those situations.
Yep. So when we've been overrun by oyster drills, they pretty much eat themselves out of house and home. They eat all the oysters that they have access to, and then they just kind of die off regardless of what salinities. Yeah. So they eat themselves out of house and home.
But then you've got a collapsed reef. You don't have anything there.
That's right.
All right, so I'm going to do the same thing with you that I do with a lot of folks. I'm going to take a page out of Dan Rather's book. What have I not asked you that I should have asked you?
I guess the only thing we haven't really touched was I talked about our yearly assessment, maybe just a little bit more information on how we come up with our flexible harvest goal.
Okay.
So every year we do quadrat surveys. So a quadrat is a standard scientific sampling technique where you take a square. In our case, we use a square yard, but you can use anything because you can convert. You can, as long as you have a known area. But we take a square yard. We dive down to the bottom of the reef, whichever reef area that we're wanting to survey. We put the square yard down, and then we scrape everything from that square yard into a bag. We'll take that back and we'll go through it. We'll count oysters, adult oysters. We'll count spat, sublegal oysters. We'll count how many drills are on it, how much shell is in there, and come up with those numbers. And then if you know the area of your main reef system, you just apply that known area of that sample to that, just a conversion factor of square yards to acres or something.
So you're just extrapolating that to get your...
Yeah, I usually report in acres when I'm talking to the oyster community. We have a yearly meeting after I do this and kind of tell them what the season's going to look like. But yeah, we'll do that. It's usually about 20 dives, and the dives will have 10 samples each. We have them on a line, all the sample bags on a line, and so we swim down the line and get 10 samples per area of interest, and those 10 samples are averaged together, and basically we use that to get an estimate of what's on the main reef. There's some error that goes with that. We're trying to figure out some techniques to spread those samples out so they're not all on a line. But for divers in the water fighting currents and things like that, it can be hard to put them down in 10 separate areas totally away from each other.
Okay.
But because it's scuba diver has to get back on the boat and be dropped down somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So we try to minimize that with the way that we do that. But it does inherently have some problems with coverage. So I always tell the oyster catchers, there's no secret. There's errors in what we do. Our samples might have been on a real productive area, and we use that to estimate what's on the larger area. Or maybe our samples, or one or two of our samples, ended up in between two reef mounds, and they're giving us zeros, and then we all apply that together, and that would lessen the amount of harvestable sacks that we estimate. Mm-hmm. So we take all that information and we come up with the best estimate that we can. I apply those, it's usually 20 dives, I'll apply those between what's done on Cedar Point East, what's done on Cedar Point West, and what's done in Heron Bay. So I come up with those three, a total sack amount, and then I come up with what the harvest sack limit would be for each of those areas. We figure out what's 100%. We don't want to take 100% oysters, so we've traditionally backed down, and we start the reef kind of having 33% harvest of the total.
Okay, so you're taking a third.
We take a third, and then if we, throughout the season, as we're monitoring it at the oyster management station and talking each week, if there's an underrepresentation, we've actually been able to say, you can have more harvest in this area, and so the number would actually go by, like say at the end of the season, it might go up to 49%, but that's based on our first estimate, which inherently had some errors. So mm-hmm. A good example, I forgot exactly which year it was. I think it was 2000, could have been 2020, could have been 21. Our Cedar Point East area, our sample said that there wasn't anything there. But we did open it up because we allow folks to kind of check for themselves, and some sacks started coming up. And so we allowed more harvest on our Cedar Point East area. And so it brought up the percent of our total harvest, but we had error and said that was zero. So in all reality, if we would have gone back and done another survey there, we probably would have gotten different results, and we probably would have been closer to 33% at the end of it if we had.
The challenge is finding your representative sample.
That's right, and we usually stick with that 33%, and that's kind of our benchmark. We're always kind of seeing where we are each week when we sit down at the table. But I don't like to use that word quota because it's not. We can open up different areas. We can close things. We can reopen areas if we had to. Sometimes we have done that before where we've closed something. I've gone and done a quick assessment just to see, and then reopened it before in the past. Generally, that's not what we do most of the time, but there are all possibilities within the harvest season.
So I'm going to make a few summary statements, and anything that I have misstated or not been completely accurate, I want you please to correct me. But basically, you have a season. Your season is fall to spring. That season is based on health reasons more so than anything else, is to ensure that the harvest is able to be managed safely such that you're not creating unsafe food conditions for what's being taken and sold. That's the primary driver behind that. Am I stating that correctly?
It is. It's a combination of both the resource numbers, the count of the resource, and trying to avoid depletion, and also trying to make sure the consumers are protected.
Okay, so the season is also around depletion.
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, we might have some opening enclosures from the health department, which we closed down all harvest to, even though we've got the numbers still. The sacks have not been harvested that we had estimated.
Okay.
And then we'll open back up, and we'll kind of keep going and see how it goes after the health department says that things are clear for us to harvest again.
Okay.
So what's interesting about the oyster management stations, one of the things that drove the need for that accountability was to help the dealers in Alabama, which are kind of becoming few and far between, the oyster processors and the oyster dealers. If we wouldn't have gone to that system, there would have been pushes to go to post-harvest processing. And I'm not sure if you know what that is, but post-harvest processing is where you could still have half-shell oysters, but they've been treated and they're actually not alive when they come to your table. So there's different ways to do it. You can do like cold pasteurization. You can do some light steam pasteurization because you still want them to seem raw. Some pressure, something. There's different techniques. Post-harvest processing, it actually kills the oyster. You don't get that live oyster that people like to have at their oyster bars and things like that. But to do that, the dealers would have to put in the infrastructure to do that. That would have taken out a lot of our dealers. And so you get two things where it's like, oh, there's more things we got to do to get our oysters. But if we didn't have the oyster management station put into place, there wouldn't be any dealers.
They'd be forced out of business because they couldn't handle the overhead involved.
Right. Some of the smaller mom and pop shops would just be gone. They wouldn't be able to do it if that ended up being required of them. And
so let me ask this, and I want to what you are dealing with here with these seasons. These are commercial. These are people selling commercially. Is there anything where you've got people who say, I'm going to go out, I'm going to get a bag, I'm going to go harvest a bag of oysters so that we can have some here at the house?
Yes.
Okay. So
you can harvest recreationally.
Okay.
And you still have to go to the oyster management station.
Okay.
And this is I'll talk about a little source of contention because it didn't always used to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll tell you what we can do now, and then I'll go back to what used to be allowed.
Sure.
So every person can get 100 oysters per person per day.
Okay.
It's about a 5-gallon bucket full of oysters.
Okay.
You, your child, your wife, your best friend, you go out on a boat, you get 100 oysters per person per day. If you get 101, you've become a commercial oyster catcher, so you would have needed to buy that commercial oyster license. And
so it behooves you to go back with 99 to make sure you didn't go to 101.
Yeah, or count them real well. They still got to follow the culling rules, and they actually have to. You can only harvest them during times and in the areas that are open to commercial harvest.
Okay.
But you don't need a saltwater fishing license. You don't need to live here. We do have a recreational oyster tag at the oyster management station, so they still have to come back at the end of their harvest. They get a tag to put on their bucket just to get them home, and that's so if enforcement sees a bucket of oysters on the road, they see this tag on and be like, okay, they went through the station. And it also helps us get an accounting of recreational harvest,
Sure.
which we've never had before. And there's quite a bit of oysters that come out recreationally that we just didn't have a good idea about.
Which also could affect your data that you're using.
Yes.
To manage.
Yep, and we convert that 100 oysters. It's about 0.6 of an Alabama sack, a current Alabama sack. So we go ahead and convert those to Alabama sacks, and we include them with what's harvested off those reefs, as they should be, because it's oyster. Okay. Those oysters don't know if they're harvested commercially or recreationally. They're just gone. Okay. So, and they contribute to what comes off that reef.
Okay, so then to that point, you were saying what used to be.
So what used to be a harvester could go out. They didn't have to stop at a check station. They go out. They did have to have tags, which they bought a handful at the office and just kept them in their glove box. They still had to tag them and write down which areas. They go out and harvest, and then they would take a half a sack home for themselves that they didn't tag. It was outside of their commercial harvest, which all needed the commercial tags on there. And so they'd all be able to take their sack or their sack and a half home, and that was for their family and things like that. And it could happen on the weekend. There wasn't any. Right now, our harvest is really Monday through Friday, and then the weekends the reefs are closed. Back in the day, they were open all year long. They were open all week long, including Saturday and Sunday, any holidays, whatever. And so they had a greater access to get the recreational oysters. They just got them while they were harvesting commercially. They'd be able to take them home, and they got what they want. Now, if you wanted to get your a sack of oysters, if you want to do them recreationally and you're a commercial harvester, you can't have them on the vessel or vehicle at the same time. You can go out and harvest, take care of all of your commercial stuff, take it to the dealer, get rid of those, and then you can go back out and harvest your 100. Or you can do it the other way around, do your 100 per person per day, take them home, then you go back out and do your commercial. And that's one way to do that. The other way would be if they wanted one of their sacks that they harvested commercially, it has to go to a dealer. The dealer still has to cool it down, and then maybe they can get it back. Then it'd be if they could wheel and deal with that dealer to be like, can I have my sack back for tomorrow? And that's all between a harvester and a dealer. If that sort of transaction would occur, they could say, hey, can I switch one out for you? So I can have one of these cool ones today and take it back home. That could happen too. But a lot of people would harvest the choice oysters for the ones they're taking home to their house. Whatever size is their favorite.
Sure.
That's a source of different opinions on the best size for oysters. But yeah, that's something that they haven't been very happy about since we started doing the oyster management stations. They're constrained to Monday through Friday. They can't just automatically take something home with them, and they've got to make 2 trips if they want to do their recreational harvest.
So what is the driver behind doing it differently now? Why is that done that way? Why? I know that's got to be a question that they're asking.
For why it's a Monday through Friday, and so the consumer portion of that, if it's harvested commercially, 80 pH, and it's driven by the National Shellfish Sanitation Guidance document that pretty much all the states follow. It's got to go to that dealer. It's got to get cooled down before it's sold to anyone to consume.
Well, what I'm saying is, why recreationally? Now you're under those same guidelines, right?
Yep. So recreationally, they've been able to harvest that, but they're constrained. They're constrained within the reef because we still need an accounting for that. Okay. If somebody just went off their pier and got their oysters, they would take them home, probably eat them. Nobody would know anything about it. But if they wanted to harvest recreationally, according to what we need them to do, so we can also account for that recreational harvest, they still have to make they don't have to check in, but they have to make one pass at the oyster management station,
which is open Monday to Friday. Yes. Which is why you have to do it then, because you've got to go to that station.
That's right.
They're not open on the weekends, therefore.
Yeah, and we've actually tried to have, for several years, we tried to open up on Saturdays, and the reason behind that is a lot of fisheries are losing their young folks. They're in school all day, or they don't have interest, or any number of things. They're not interested in what mom and dad did, or their grandpa did, or whatever. And so we opened up for several years. We tried it for the first 4 Saturdays of the season just to see what kind of participation. And we were aiming for people to bring their kids out to learn how to do it, to see if there's interest in it. We weren't requiring anything besides just allowing, that extra Saturday, something where kids weren't in school. They could try their hand at it and see if they wanted to do that, maybe build some interest in it for the next generation of harvesters, because it's dwindling. It's you'll have a few new folks in here and there, but it's you don't see a lot of young guys get into it.
And how much of that is the changing in the culture, and how much of it is it's harder and harder to make a living at it?
I think it's a bit of both. It's a bit of both. So they're not as plentiful. Folks used to bring 20 bushels of oysters in. That's you talk to some of the older gentlemen, and they talk about the heydays where they would brought 20 sacks in or 40 sacks in a day, and brought it up to the canning folks or whatever. And of course, those facilities aren't there anymore. But they just don't. We can't sustain that type of harvest anymore, And so maybe if we can get our reefs back up to historical levels, we can open things up more and things like that. But I think that it's really important for our industry to have that accountability. And I know the oyster catchers sometimes argue with the closure and things like that, but the majority of them do see how it's helped.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of them. A lot of the older gentlemen are the ones that really they are far thinking. They think ahead, and just like we've got to be careful, guys. You can't just take everything. And these are our experienced ones. Some of the younger ones, they just kind of sometimes see, hey, I can make $500 today, and I don't have to go. I can maybe do it in one day, and I've got my money for the week or whatever, and they're not really thinking about long term. Mm-hmm. And so, and I appreciate those guys that I can sit and talk about long term. So I've got the conversations that I have with some of these guys. They fall into categories. There's the ones where we're sitting and talking, not always agreeing on everything, but sitting and talking and have a conversation about what needs to be done and what we think needs to be done. And then there's the guys that just kind of tell you what you're doing wrong, and they don't let you answer, and they tell you all there's some conspiracy theories and all that sort of stuff. And it's just you can't have a good conversation. It's not productive. You're just trying to be polite and all that. So, but I really appreciate those guys that I can sit down and talk to.
And that group, you said you don't always agree. They've got their ideas about what should be done. You've got your ideas about what should be done. How often do you ever? And I'm trying to word this in a way that is open ended, so it provides a means for an opportunity to elaborate on it. But hadn't thought of that. That's a good idea. Let me consider that. Let me look into that. Do you have those kinds of ideas that come from that community that we never thought of that? Let's investigate that and see how that'll work.
Yeah, we do. We definitely do. A good example of that is the majority of the culture that we're using these days to restore is limestone. Mm-hmm. We've used 57 limestone. That's about dime to quarter size. That was kind of historically what we would put down if we were putting down limestone, but we've actually gone up a size.
Okay.
We've gone up to number 4 limestone, and just about the size of a plum. It's actually about the size of a 3-inch oyster.
Yeah, I was going to say it's pretty close to their shell.
Yeah. So and that was suggested by folks in our oyster community, and sometimes they'll complain about having to harvest rock is a little heavier or whatever, but what it does is they have to knock that off. They can't just put that straight into their bag and take it to the dealer, because the dealer pays for their oysters by weight. And so if they're getting a bunch of rock instead of oysters, they're going to put a stop to it really quick. So they have to knock it off, and that culch has to stay in the water. They don't take it with them. And so a planting that you do with number 4 limestone there's some dissolution of the material, but it'll last 10 to 15 years and still be available for settlement as long as there's no hasn't been covered over by any sediments.
Sure.
Oyster shell, you might get 3 years out of an oyster shell if you put it in there. It gets all crumbly, and it's just a softer material. It's perfectly good for settlement, but if you're not having much settlement on it, it deteriorates really quick. Mm-hmm. So the number 4 limestone lasts a long time. They have to leave it. It's something that persists out there and will be there for at least 10 to 15 years, doing its job of catching that larvae and being a substrate for that to form. And so far we've had really good luck with that. And that came from oyster industry.
And so when you do things like that, I'm hoping that what they see is, guys, we're partners in this. We're looking for your ideas. We're looking because what we all want is for the oyster population to recover. We're not doing this to make your lives harder, and we want, in fact, to make your lives easier.
Yes.
But you got to work with us. You got to help us get there.
Yeah, and it's neat to talk to these guys. They'll have some ideas. They have a lifetime of observations.
Yeah.
And sometimes they can't explain what happened there, and it's neat when you can kind of chit-chat with them and figure out something. A great example of that, I was talking to an oyster harvester, and he said, I know that once they settle, they can't move, but I've seen them in Heron Bay where I'm nipping at them. Nips are just small tongs. usually little eight-inch tong heads, ricks. And then all of a sudden, the weather will change, and then they bury up. You're saying that they buried themselves. Now, clams, they can bury themselves. They got that tongue. They can push through the sediment and move through there. Scallops, they can open and close their valve and kind of swim a little ways away. But oysters, once they're attached, they're attached. So we start to, it's like, that doesn't make any sense to me, man, because they can't, it's like, I know, it doesn't make any sense, but they totally disappeared. And we start talking about it. It's just like, you know what probably happened? So the weather changed, so there's something with the pressure, and the animals, they can sense all kinds of stuff coming through. Maybe a storm's coming through, and inherently they do that, so they don't get a whole lot of sediment tied up in their gills or anything. I'm just kind of speculating at that point. But they stop filtering.
Right.
And they are spitting water when they're filtering. That's all part of it. And when they spit water, they're keeping the sediment flowing around them. And if they all close up and they stop spitting, all the sediment that's heavy enough to settle down just settles and covers them on top. And we're talking about that, and it's just like, yeah, that settlement just covered them up. They didn't bury themselves in. And there's, all right, that makes a lot of sense. And I just love those interactions and those conversations. It's like, you have a real observation, and you have real information, and we're trying to figure out, why it turned out the way you did. They have real observations as to where they've seen oysters grow and what they think an oyster needs and where they think they grow best and all of that. And we're getting to the point where we're having more of those conversations and trying to make sure that it's y'all's oyster reef. You can have some say as to and ideas are valued as to where things go. If there's something, every once in a while you get something totally off the wall, and you got to be like, no, that's not gonna. We're not putting it there. But for the most part, these guys do have real experience on the water.
Yeah, and the thing I see, you can correct me on this also, but there's what you guys are doing is you're finding that I'm thinking like a Venn diagram where you have the intersection. You've got the intersection between theoretical and practical knowledge, and where that lives, the bigger you can make that area where those two circles intersect, the better off you are. That's the more common ground you find that way.
Right, and I think we're all going to be better for it.
Exactly.
We're not always going to be, that's management, and they're trying to do something that we don't like, and this is the harvesters or the industry, and they're trying to do something that management doesn't like. I think we're having good success so far in communication and trying to work towards the same goals.
Okay. So and we've gone way beyond what I thought we would go in terms of time, and I've still got questions, but I don't want to keep taking up too much of your time. But just briefly, if you could describe, how the commercial farms fit into this.
All right. So historically, we've had private beds, and so it's one of those older laws that allows people on waterfront property to have a private bed 1,800 feet from their, and it's written in the Code of Alabama. They can have 1,800 feet to plant and gather oysters, so they can have the oyster resources within that. And the caveats to that is they can't take anything from the public. So I have to go and survey the bottoms. I call it examination of the bottom. I'm looking for existing oyster resources. If I find existing oyster resources of a certain amount or density, they can't do what they want to do. They can't have private use of those. But if there's really nothing there, and anything they put in there is what they've provided and worked on, and the products that come out are stuff that they've started, there might be some natural settlement too, and that's okay. But then they can do that. So historically, that's all been planting and gathering oysters on the bottom. And what I just talked about is really most of what they needed to do. They needed to also provide us a map. They're in a file, and then they can do what they want to do. These days with the Australian long line and these things where you put in anchors and poles and lines and stuff like that. So now you got infrastructure, and you have the possibility of interfering with waterway traffic or on a seagrass bed or something like that. So they actually have to deal with the Corps of Engineers, and they do a joint permit between the Corps of Engineers and the Alabama Department of Environmental Management. And so they work together to make sure the things you put in are okay to be there. And through that is kind of a conglomeration of all the blessings of all the agencies. So they get our letter of that, we've done the examination of the bottom, and they provided everything for us. Marine police will look at it, the archaeological surveys, the They'll make sure that there's not but they basically have the blessing from everyone. Then they get their permit, and then they can do what they need to. They go through state lands. They might have to establish an easement fee. There's a lot, and I'm not going to go all the way down that way. But
that's crazy how much
it's gotten better, but it's not perfect yet. Going through all the permitting. So marine resources part of it is actually pretty simple, but it is the first thing, the first part of it, and then everybody will write them a little letter that says, "Oh, you've been approved to plant and gather oysters on bottom. You can use this letter for any other agencies, any other permitting if you want to try off bottom or whatever."
Okay.
And then, but it can get pretty back and forth with the different agencies.
Right. Well, what I saw, like when I was looking at, the artificial reef stuff that I saw, like where they had these structures that they created that for estuarial type use, they remind me almost of like a fondue fountain. It's progressively, it's like stacked like a wedding cake, and it's progressively as you go down, it's bigger, and it just basically looks like a circular pyramid that they have, and so I mean, you would have multiple levels on that. I mean, like 4, 5, 6 levels. It could be sitting on the bottom, but then it's stacked up above that you would be potentially seeding and having, with your different levels of production. How does that work?
So generally around here, people try to get them off the bottom.
Okay.
Just because of the drills will find them. They'll even crawl up the line and all the way down the line and find the baskets, and you still have to pull them off the baskets and things like that.
Oh, wow.
But you have workers that'll do that. They're constantly going through the baskets, pulling out the dead ones. A lot of extra infrastructure for these guys, a lot of extra hands on, a lot of extra things they need to do. So what they charge is a lot more than what you would charge for something coming off the public reef. Doesn't mean they're not growing out of the same water or things like that.
There's more overhead involved, though.
Yeah, more overhead involved, and so of course they're going to charge a little bit more. And their oysters will probably look. Remember, I was talking about defouling. They'll look a little bit prettier on the plate. Mm-hmm. But they do put a lot into it to do that, and they to make a profit. They have to charge
Sure.
for that, and people will pay for that though because they want a nice product like that. But it's been an interesting ride trying to, as aquaculture has increased in Alabama, we've had to revisit some of the laws that were just associated with the public harvest. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that they do, they have to take them out of the baskets when they're getting too big and separate them out so they don't crowd themselves in the basket. A crowded oyster is a weird looking oyster. It's shaped funny, and that's not what they want. And sometimes they'll actually take them out. We call it oyster cannon. They'll tumble them, and it'll help keep them clean, and they can grade them out and get their sizes perfect, and then they repackage them and put them back in the water. But that first time you take them out of the water, we had to figure out a way, because officially that's a harvest on the old law, the way that's done. You have to come up with something that covers this thing that they want to do and actually kind of need to do to make it worthwhile. You have to evolve your laws as you go along to make sure it fits their needs, as long as the consumer is still protected and they're able to make a profit and all of that sort of stuff. And so it's been interesting to see how it evolves and what different things we need to do. And in that case, you're always having a dialogue with the aquaculture guys and saying, well, what are you wanting to do? What do you need to do? Well, let's see if we got anything we got to change or add to, or have something specifically for aquaculture.
And I would presume that with aquaculture, it's no different from than with agriculture, is you have techniques and equipment that changes over time. That's going to change what the needs of the laws are at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess for the health department thing to protect consumers when they have these intermittent harvests, I guess, that they'll actually go back in, they have to remain in the water for a prescribed amount of time to cleanse out any bacteria that they may have occurred. I want to definitely say that for consumers.
Right.
The private guys are mandated to keep them in the water for, I think it's 14 days before they can truly harvest them to go to the shops. And that's to make sure that anything that they've acquired while they were maybe at an elevated temperature during these processes, they have purged those things. So bacteria, if there's some viral growth and stuff, all those things can be purged. The things that are not good, if you're in an area where there's heavy metals and stuff like that, those things kind of stay with the tissues. And those are the areas that the health department closes down to harvest in the first place. So everything you can harvest here is in conditionally approved waters.
Okay.
And they don't have those heavy metal problems and pesticides and all that sort of stuff. So that's part of the sanitary survey that they have to do.
Okay.
But yeah, they're trying to come up with. They're coming up with new ideas of the ways to do it, and we have to evolve with those as well. So I'll always open an ear and see what's going on, and if it fits into something that and reasonably fits into something that we already have on the books, then they'll need to follow that. If there's something that can be changed or a reg that can be put in there, or something that we try to accommodate.
So Jason, I want to say thank you. I'm going to go ahead and because I try to be respectful of people's time. We've been at this, I can't see this thing real clear, but it's going on 2 hours. I think that we've been here talking. And I don't know how it seemed to you. It hasn't seemed like that to me, because this has been fascinating for me, because I knew nothing. I knew, next to nothing about this coming in. I mean, what I've been able to glean just in coming down here doing the podcast, and then, things around looking on the internet and those kinds of things. But, people who have been involved in the industry for all their lives have been trying to find some actual oystermen to talk to. Those guys are busy. Imagine that they're actually trying to make a living. So, haven't been able to do that, and so I really, really, really appreciate your time. I want to again mention that. Been talking to Jason Herrmann at the Alabama Marine Resources. That's part of the Alabama Conservation and Natural Resources. And we've been talking for a long time now about the oyster industry, the history of the oyster industry and its management, and been very illuminating. If you go to the restaurant and you order oysters on the half shell, or you get fried oysters, whatever it is that you get, there's a lot that goes into ensuring that, number one, that those resources are well managed, so that you can continue having those in the future, number one, but also making sure that what you have is safe to eat. And so that's really important. And of course, what's come out of this conversation is, just how much things impact that you maybe didn't think about before. When they open the dam up in Gunnersville, eventually it impacts things down here in the Gulf, and that's maybe not something that you would have thought about before. So thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
And looking forward to sharing this with subscribers for Dauphin Island Diaries. That's going to do it for today, and hope you guys enjoy this. Hey, Big John here again, and I wanted to tell you that one of the things I love about podcasting is that it allows you to take me wherever life takes you. Whether you're driving to work, walking the beach, mowing the yard, sitting in an airport, or heading out on a road trip, Dauphin Island Diaries can go right along with you there. So if you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're following the podcast on your favorite platform. You'll find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and just about everywhere podcasts are available. And while you're there, I'd sure appreciate it if you consider leaving a rating or a review. It helps more people discover the stories of Dauphin Island and the Alabama Gulf Coast. And so, as always, thanks so much for listening.